From a military and security perspective, militaries around the world have always been used to respond to natural disasters and extreme weather events, right? Typhoons, hurricanes, wildfires. What we've seen now is how frequently militaries are deployed in response to extreme weather events of the kind driven by climate change. And what we've seen is just a huge increase over time as these extreme weather events come more frequently and more intensely than ever before. The pace is just picking up.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to WTF Now, a podcast by Ep7. I'm Rick Wheaton. Our guest this time is someone who sits right at the intersection of climate, security, and geopolitics, Erin Sikorsky. Erin is the director of the Center for Climate and Security. Before that, she spent over a decade in the U.S. intelligence community, leading teams that examined conflict, instability, and long-term strategic risks. She co-authored the Quadrennial Global Trends Report, which is published by the National Intelligence Council and assesses the key forces shaping our world. She's now one of the world's leading voices on how climate change is impacting national security, not as a distant threat, but as something already disrupting militaries, economies, and communities today. In this conversation, Erin helps us better understand how extreme weather is already stretching armed forces, how climate stress is and will continue to be a threat multiplier that fuels instability and creates new opportunities for the West's enemies, how great disruption often gives way to great innovation, and how the retreat from science, evidence, and cooperation in parts of the West risks eroding our collective resilience. She argues that climate change isn't just an environmental problem, it's a geopolitical one, and that if the United States is turning inward, Europe and its partners will need to decide whether they can help steady the global system and keep evidence-based leadership alive. For business and policy leaders trying to make sense of a world where risk is compounding faster than institutions can adapt, this episode is a reminder that resilience is the prize for leaders that exercise foresight, adaptability, and decision advantage. Here comes Erin. Erin Sikorsky, so happy you could join us today from Washington, D.C. We're really excited to do an episode with you that looks at climate from a couple different perspectives, climate change, but also I hope it's okay to take advantage of the fact that you are in Washington. So you're observing some of the things that are happening there from a little bit closer vantage point than those of us that are here in Europe. The first, I guess the starter to get us going here is I was frankly relieved to hear from the president's UN speech that climate change is no longer anything that any of us needs to be worried about. And I just wanted to sort of throw the ball to you to hear your reflections on that sentiment.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that nice? If we just don't talk about it anymore, it's going to go away. I saw the Department of Energy now in the United States has said climate change is not a word you can use in any of your writing there. So it's just going to disappear. No, obviously, it's you can't close your eyes, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, right? It's here, and people in the United States are experiencing it every week practically and around the world. And I think, coming out of a national security and geopolitical background, the thing that makes me worried is that the United States is going to get left behind and put itself more at risk and be caught off guard by pretending that climate is no longer an issue that we all need to care about.
Exactly right. So your book focuses basically on what climate change means for the Department of Defense and for the security sector generally around the world. And I found it very interesting because I follow these things pretty intensively. But for me, they pop up as a blip in a news feed here and a blip in a news feed here, et cetera. And you've sort of taken all of that over a number of years, as I understood you did in your Twitter feed as well, or your X feed or whatever it's called now, and just put it all next to each other. And then that allowed you to do some sense making on top of it. So if you were to summarize, did you say that you started that X feed in 2022-ish, right? So for a very long time, climate scientists were telling us that this was something that we needed to worry about and we needed to be prepared for, but that it was sometime in the future that we were going to really start to experience the impacts. Your X feed and your book suggest something different. Could you give us a little description of the trajectory?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think, again, from a military and security perspective, militaries around the world have always been used to respond to natural disasters and extreme weather events, right? Typhoons, hurricanes, wildfires. What we've seen now and what I was tracking on X, and now we track it at the Center for Climate and Security, which I lead, is how frequently militaries are deployed in response to extreme weather events of the kind driven by climate change. And what we've seen is just a huge increase over time as these extreme weather events come more frequently and more intensely than ever before. The pace is just picking up. And you've got the head of the National Guard in California here in the States, for example, saying, we don't have a fire season anymore. We have a fire year, right? It's not just a couple months that you can expect to be deployed, but it's any time. You know, you had the
Right.
fires in Los Angeles last winter. It's not just the summer months. And so as militaries are being deployed, you know, for longer and longer stretches, it's raising real questions in many capitals of, can we sustain this? How do we sustain this? What does it mean for our national security if our troops are constantly fighting fires instead of training for, say, a contingency in the South China Sea or over Taiwan?
Right.
You see these debates coming more to the fore, and it's not just the US, it's everywhere. It's all over the place.
And it's interesting, right? Because as you said, and I have a distant background as a logistics officer in the US Army many years ago after school. And you said some other things in the book that struck me. It's very convenient that they don't expect overtime. They tend to be physically fit. They're pretty ready to go. So, in a sense, they're like the ideal force to throw onto the playing field when you've got to do something like that, right? But their core mission is something that's completely different. And as this becomes a more and more frequent ask, it tires out the force. It keeps them from potentially training and being focused on what they should. And it also does a job that probably lots of other agencies and stakeholders should be learning about, preparing for, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the challenge here is also that militaries not only are responding to these events, but they're also being affected by them, right?
Yeah.
So military infrastructure, critical infrastructure of countries gets decimated by extreme weather events here in the US. Tyndall Air Force Base, which I talk about in the book, it's always kind of the key example, billions of dollars of loss of critical equipment, right? Interruption of training and huge impacts also on morale for the military because all the airmen that were stationed at Tyndall when it was destroyed by Hurricane Michael in 2018, they all had to go elsewhere. They had to pack up their families, they had to move to new bases, didn't know how long it would be. And they've actually tracked increased separation from the Air Force in the wake of this disaster because of the interruption for the soldiers. So there's like a whole range of ways in which climate is affecting
Yeah.
militaries that, again, if you're not paying attention to, not willing to understand, you're going to undermine the strength of your force.
Right, exactly. As you know, you mentioned 292 installations in the U.S. that are within 2 kilometers of the coastline and are relatively low lying, right? And I mean, I've got a list of keywords that I pulled out of some of those chapters. You know, an uptick in sunny day flooding is what you called it, right? At Tyndall, maybe it wasn't Tyndall, maybe it was elsewhere. The runway actually melted.
Oh yeah, that was in the UK. Yeah, due to heat. Yep. Mhm.
Exactly right. You know, and then we're going to get into combat operations in other parts of the world here in a minute, so I won't give away any of those. But in places like Alaska, you know, lots of those facilities, if not all of those facilities, are built on permafrost, right? And Arctic warming is 4x what it is in the rest of the world, right? So it's really really stunning. So and interestingly, you know, for the purpose of this podcast, where we're trying to help business leaders maintain some level of fluency around some of the key things going on. In the same sentences where you mentioned those 292 installations close to within 2 kilometers of the water's edge, you also mentioned some 3,000 port locations, commercial ports, right?
Mhm.
So going back to my sort of joking first question, you know, you can ignore this at your peril, but unfortunately, it's coming to a theater near you. I'm from the People's Republic of Vermont, and we would have thought that Vermont was a relatively safe place, but Vermonters have learned over the last 20 or 30 years that because of our narrow and steep river valleys where most of our communities are clustered, that's the perfect storm for very heavy rain events. And I learned years ago in Istanbul from Al Gore at one of his climate reality things. You can imagine the atmosphere like an enormous bathtub in a rainstorm like the drain. And those rainstorms can pick up moisture from vast areas and drop it in one place. You put all those things together and you get something that you called, if I find it here, these back-to-back climate catastrophes, which compound on each other and then ultimately just overwhelm everything in their path.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned the private sector, you mentioned the impact on businesses. I think a lot of these same principles apply that we talk about when we're talking about the military. If you're making decisions based on outdated understandings of how the climate works, right?
Mm.
What to expect, you're going to miss things or get things wrong. You're going to make investments in the wrong places, right? Things are going to cost a lot more than you expect going forward. So, I think when I think national security, I think competition, right? And decision advantage. I was an intelligence analyst for a long time. My job was to
Right.
provide policymakers decision advantage. And those, countries or those companies that are taking into account climate, I think have an advantage going forward because they're going to be more resilient and better prepared. And that's, again, getting back to our president here in the US and what he said at the UN last week, that makes me worried that we're losing that decision advantage in this space. And at a time when, we have preeminent scientific institutions in the US,
Mm.
right? We've done this really well for a long time. It's just
It's
a,
sort of like
a
giving up the
self-inflicted
advantage.
wound.
Absolutely, right, and that's the really horrifying thing about it, and I've found it interesting that he pursues that line of thinking when he talks to his base, which is what he must have been doing when he spoke from the stage at the UN, because he said different things when he met Ursula von der Leyen and the Secretary General of the UN in private later, right?
Mhm.
I've been following sort of loosely in the news the number of states where you start to hear about lender or home loan bank stress
Mhm.
and home insurance stress, right? And you have the sorts of events that we've seen over the past few years in places like Hawaii, California, Florida, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it would seem to me that a lot of the folks who are that base are going to be closer, probably, to the very soon impacts of a home insurer or a bank saying, hey, this isn't working out for us because of where you chose to buy, et cetera. Are you guys tracking that as well? And do you see that sort of social side of things moving more rapidly?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you're exactly right that insurance companies understand risk better than almost anybody, right? And the
Right.
decisions they're making right now about their businesses reflect their understanding of climate risks. And I think those it's becoming more real for a lot of Americans. And I think again, this is where when we talk about national security, right? What does it mean to keep the United States safe and secure? And keep communities safe and secure. And so when you're threatening people's economic livelihoods, you're threatening their ability to own a home, right? And take care of their families. Climate change is at the top of the list of things that. And so and you see that reflected in how a lot of states are approaching their policies and focus in this area. I think, one of the things in this challenging moment at the federal government level in the US, I do think you see a lot of opportunity and progress and leadership at the state level, the subnational level. We've been putting more focus as an organization on what does it mean for Florida to be secure from climate change, right? What does it mean for Wisconsin, my home state, to be secure from climate change? And so I think there is opportunity there because, as you said, people are experiencing this in their backyards and in their pocketbooks in a way that maybe 10 years ago didn't seem likely.
Yeah, over and over again. I remember 2 years ago, I was in Vermont with my kids, and we went into this cafe in Waterbury Center, Vermont, that had a very steep and tall step. And I said, hey, this is a part of town that completely washed away, and all these businesses had to basically start over. And then 2 weeks later, it happened again after we'd left, right? So over and over and over again for these poor folks. So I mentioned before I was in the military way back when, and you'll get no stolen valor from me. I never saw anything that came anywhere near to resembling anything that a military exists to do. Right? It was a very peaceful period when I was in, but I did spend some time in the Mojave Desert wearing NBC gear, right? Nuclear, biological, chemical gear when it was very hot. And we always followed something very closely that was called the wet bulb temperature, right? So, can you walk us in a little bit to how the military thinks about operations given the effects of climate change?
Yeah, I mean, the example you gave of operating in heat, extreme heat, I think is one of the most tangible ways in which the military or militaries really around the world have been thinking about climate. Obviously shaped in the US and NATO context by operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Experiencing extreme heat there, but also training in the US. The number of what they call black flag days where it's too
Mm.
hot really for troops to be out for very long has increased significantly over the past decade, to the point where the military is thinking about swapping its training schedule so you train at night instead of during
Right,
the day in some of these places. Although we know now with climate change, one of the big challenges of extreme heat is it's not cooling off at night the way it
right.
once did. And so that is an even opportunity. But, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy and Installations was a guy named Richard Kidd in the last administration. And he gave a speech early in his tenure talking about the need for the military to own the heat the way they once owned the night, right? Talking about
Mm.
night vision and building that technology. So I think that is one area of focus, not only for the soldiers themselves, but for equipment as well. So investments
Right.
in equipment that can operate. The British military has experienced this in Afghanistan, having trucks break down that weren't calibrated to the heat that was expected. It also affects ships that need to cool with they usually uptake water from the ocean. If the ocean is hotter than ever, then that cooling won't happen. Your ship design will fail, right? So that kind of whole technical piece is a big piece of where militaries are focused and where there's a lot of overlap, I think, or potential synergy with private sector
Right.
investments as well, where demand can come from the military for innovation and new technologies, and then that technology can be shared outside the military. I think the same is happening on the clean energy side in militaries as well. Again, not because, the militaries become environmentalists who are doing this because they care about the environment, but because there are real operational benefits to clean energy on the battlefield, right? It's quiet for the enemy. You need less fuel to the front, which again, in Afghanistan, many, many casualties were along supply lines bringing water and fuel to the front. If you don't have to do that as often, you can save lives. So, yeah, there's a lot of innovation happening. And I will say in the US, I think some of that is still ongoing, even under the Trump administration. It's just much quieter and it's called different things. Talk about extreme weather, not climate change. Talk about resilience, right?
Exactly. Aaron, I can never miss the opportunity also to mention how inefficient fossil fuel combustion is for generating movement. It can be quite efficient if you're doing it in the right way to try to generate heat. But when you use it to try to generate motion, you inadvertently still create the heat. And in fact, only get about 36, 40% of the energy used for motion. So basically, all of the rest of that money, you've literally just pissed away as what's called thermodynamic loss, right? So
Hmm.
the fuel budget for the Department of Defense must be absolutely amazing. And if we can get that sort of insight in, hey, the vast majority of what you're spending here and then moving, and then you're wasting 65% of the fuel that you're using to move the fuel that you're then going to waste 65% of to it compounds, right? So, and a global value chain that seeks to do what the Department of Defense does in the US, that's a huge waste of money. So when we're talking about society, we talk about that as like the biggest wealth transfer actually. You're getting society to pay 60% extra for something, and then you're letting the people who own the oil and gas companies keep the money. And a few of the wars are also to protect those. You end up in a really interesting space if you follow that all the way. So, you also mentioned, though, that extreme heat and the effects of climate change are also providing some advantages to some of the enemies that the US military has faced over the years. Tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I started my career working in counterterrorism, right? And was focused on Iraq and the Middle East and then also East Africa for a
Mhm.
while. And that's where I really first started thinking about this nexus between climate and security because I was seeing in East Africa in particular, that extremist groups like Al Shabaab would be able to benefit from extreme weather and heat events in a couple different ways. One is, they often would have the advantage on the battlefield in those extreme environments because they were operating as guerrilla forces, right? Not
Right.
traditional militaries full of equipment and being weighed down and overheated, but also that with the population, they were able to take advantage, especially when governments couldn't provide water or food in the face of drought, right, or agricultural loss. Joining and working with Al Shabaab seemed like a pretty good deal in those
Yeah.
cases. And my anecdotal experience is backed up by academic research that shows that extremists often benefit when climate hazards hit because it changes the cost benefit, right, of joining an extremist group and provides opportunities there. It also, I mean, beyond terrorism and extremists, I think there we see increasingly extreme weather and climate providing opportunities for countries like Russia to sow disinformation in the wake of extreme weather events. So, kind of take their playbook, which they use on lots of different issues, but apply it to climate change. And one example I'll give you is in Poland last year. Storm Boris hit Eastern Europe, caused the worst flooding in decades. The Polish military deployed over 20,000 troops to help its citizens. And at the same time, they saw a 300% increase, is what their cybersecurity office said, 300% increase in disinformation emanating from Russia and Belarus aimed at undermining the Polish government about their response to the extreme weather. Right. So trying to divide the population from the government by saying they're not responding well, they didn't take care of you, this is all their fault. Right.
Mm.
So there are lots of ways in which climate is providing opportunities for bad actors to take advantage.
Yeah, exactly right. And I mean, interestingly, like we would say that the US has a professional army, right? Where you've got lots of folks from all over the country who have, I guess, different degrees of promise ahead of them in their lives based on where they grow up in their families and level of education, et cetera, who see the military as an opportunity for them. And then when I was reading, some of what you were saying about the Taliban recruiting farmers who had, and I guess this happened during the Arab Spring too, and with ISIS or Daesh in Iraq, people who had lost their livelihoods because of sustained drought were finally offered a steady income of, I think you said $5 a day or something like that in the book, and suddenly they're part of a professional army too. So quote unquote professional army, but you can't blame some of these folks for doing that in a way when they're thinking like, okay, my family is starving, we've been kicked off our land, and now I have an option. And the Taliban and others have taken very good advantage of that, right? So super interesting.
I think this is why it's both so fascinating to study and to work on because there's so many different angles, but also why it's so hard
Mm,
for governments and militaries in particular who are, I think, pretty accustomed to thinking linear, right? And thinking
right.
one threat at a time, thinking threats come from states, right? And climate really upends a lot of that. And so certainly I think a threat multiplier framework is helpful to a certain extent. And what we were just talking about with extremist groups, right?
Mhm,
Al-Shabaab is already a threat, Daesh is already a threat, and then you add
right.
climate on top and it makes it a more serious challenge. But I think there are also places that we think of as stable, right? That we don't think of as being a threatening environment or a threatening situation, and where you add climate or bring extreme weather into the mix, and it's actually going to open the opportunity for new risks to emerge. You think about and here I'll give you an example related to nuclear power, for example, where
Mhm,
France relies heavily on nuclear power. But when you have drought and the rivers are running low across the country,
yeah.
in the past couple of years, they've had to actually turn off or shut down briefly their nuclear power plants because they don't have enough water for cooling. That's an example of a new kind of energy security threat that
Yeah,
absent climate change wouldn't exist, right?
exactly.
So it's reimagining your baseline, I think, and figuring out how climate is affecting kind of the fabric of all national security concerns.
Indeed, right? So, one of the best books I've ever read on the topic was by Bill McKibben, and it was called Earth,
Mm,
and he misspelled it with two A's. And his story was the reason we need to think about Spelling it the way I've suggested is because our activities over the past couple of years have changed everything.
Mm,
And importantly, and I think this is a lot of what you're talking about, climate change means that we designed a lot of our infrastructure, a lot of our life, a lot of our water consumption, you name it, fast fashion, blah, 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 blah. We designed it for the climate we had, not the climate we're about to have, or maybe already have. I live in Oslo, Norway, on a hilltop in an off grid place with solar and all this sort of stuff, right? And I had, I don't know, maybe 12 or 15 Americans come visit this summer. And by the end of the summer, which was a drought, I had no water because
mm,
Americans like to shower. So there's going to be some big changes that need to happen
huh,
to the way that we live.
mhm.
So, okay, so if we set the climate topic to the side, and the name of the book, Aaron,
Climate change on the battlefield.
it's a really cool read. It's really easy to get a hold of online, and there's so many interesting statistics and sense making done there. A quick break from the serious stuff. If you're enjoying the podcast, please give us a like, leave a review, or hit follow. It helps more people find What the Fuck Now, and it keeps our algorithm overlords happy. So the second topic that we wanted to get into is, and this is frankly one we've been looking forward to talking to you about since the inauguration and the aftermath. We're sitting here in Europe, most of our audiences as well. More airports in Denmark last night experienced unknown drone activity. I think it was yesterday or the day before, the Danish press found out that there was a Russian military ship off the coast with its AIS, its identification system, turned off, just sitting off there darkly. And Friday, we did our first in the series with General Lamb, who we've talked about before. And his basic words were, just because it doesn't look like a war you recall doesn't mean you're not in a war now.
Mm,
So understand where you are. And now Norwegians and Europeans have thought for a very long time that if all goes to hell, their very rational American good friends on the other side of the Atlantic are going to be great teammates. Should we be worried?
yeah, I think Europe should be worried. I think the uncertainty emanating out of Washington is at an all-time high, right? And what you hear one day might change the next. And certainly, I think the focus has turned inward significantly from this White House. And, all credit to Mark Rutte and NATO this summer and bringing President Trump along at that meeting. But I, I think there's no guarantee that that lasts. And we've already seen pulling back from some Baltic state security agreements, right? We know the defense, national defense strategy is very focused on the homeland and domestic challenges. And so yeah, I think, assumptions about the US and its role need to be questioned and challenged. And to be fair, to Europe, I think that I see a broad recognition of that, but recognition is not the same as action, right? And that takes time and effort. But yeah, no, I think it's an incredibly dangerous moment. And my sense of what you're seeing from Moscow is an effort to push at that, right? And see where we are exactly and test those boundaries a bit.
Exactly. In the press over the past few weeks or so, there's been some celebration because of the deal done with the UK for, I think, 5 frigates or something like that.
Mm,
And when I look at that news and then I think about some of the things that we're all observing when we pay attention to the European security space and what General Lamb said on Friday, for example, I don't know, getting 5 frigates that are going to start to be delivered in 2035 doesn't seem that comforting. So it seems like there's a real, there's a time issue here, and
mhm,
I'm not even talking about war. I'm just talking about preparedness being deterrence.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think, look, I also think in the United States, you have not just the president, you have Congress, right? And you
Right.
have, I think, still in both parties, very serious actors who are very concerned about Russia and can in some cases act as pressure on this White House on this topic.
Mhm.
So, I think, like I said, I think the signals were good after the NATO summit, but it's been mixed since then. But all regardless, I think a focus on for Europe of building its own domestic resilience, and that's what I heard when I was at the NATO summit was a huge focus
Right.
on hybrid warfare,
Yep.
right? And being prepared for that. I think, the one thing I will say there I think is interesting is this huge talk about hybrid warfare. And as you say, General Lamb saying this doesn't look like the war we expect, but it could be war
Mm.
nevertheless. But yet then this continued focus on building traditional military equipment, right? This
Yeah.
5% that all NATO countries have to
Right.
invest. I think asking some questions about are we matching what we understand the threat to be with where we're making our investments
Mm.
is one that more European countries maybe need to be asking as they go forward. And I do think there's an intersection then here with climate change, frankly, because you're thinking about resilience, right? Domestic resilience, food security domestically, right? Ability to move things from point A to point B across the continent. All of that is affected by climate as well. I think it's a moment where, frankly, things like strategic foresight or scenario planning,
Mm.
all of that is really important to get this right.
And a recognition of the seriousness too, because if we find ourselves in a reality where the quite powerful and well resourced military industrial complex is very eager to sell us the stuff they've got on the shelf,
Hmm.
that's going to consume lots of cash, but maybe not be
Hmm.
what ultimately prepares us. And not to mention the cyber warfare and the information warfare that's going on extremely effectively, right? And the number of ships that manage to drag their anchors from St. Petersburg to the northern tip of Denmark. So it's let me reframe the should we be worried question a little
Hmm.
bit and just look at it purely internally focused in the US right now. We are not that many days post the killing of Charlie Kirk. There's been a lot of very heated rhetoric about political violence. There appear, at least from where we're sitting, to also have been some concerning things said about free speech is acceptable as long as it's our free speech. You have the Colbert and the Kimmel thing. Should we be worried about those sort of things, or do you feel that the center has a chance of holding?
I think that center has a chance of holding. I mean, I think the United States has a long history of ups and downs, and we have a lot of people who are concerned about this moment. And I think the return of Kimmel to the airwaves shows that there are some red lines, I think, for the population, and pushing back. But again, that doesn't mean it's not a very risky and dangerous moment as well. And I think, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is the power differentials in the conversation, right? I mean, it's one thing to have a random person on the internet saying something terrible. It's a much different thing to have senior leaders in the White House,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Repeating those same things. And so I think that's the difference or the real challenge in this moment. But I think, America's a big place with a lot
Mm.
of communities and different people. And going back to something I said earlier about that subnational leadership,
Mhm.
I think that is a place where we're seeing a real positive action as well to keep communities safe, to think about what resilience and security really means for communities. And so, for there's lots of studies that have been done too in terms of trust in government levels. And right, the closer the government official is to the community, the higher trust there is. So local
Right.
mayors have the most trust usually, right? And so I think that's an opportunity in the US to build on as well. But again, it's a really uncertain moment.
The US has had so much good data
Mm.
in order to conduct research, do science. I talked about heat waste and fossil fuel consumption. That comes from some great work from the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. They've been keeping track of that for many years, right? So you've got the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, you've got the National Institute of Health, you've got an unlimited number of places that have really contributed and on behalf of the world over the past 75, 80 years, really, on a range of topics. And then you've got Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and some of the things that he's prepared to say about health and what
Mhm.
constitutes responsible health choices. And those are then parroted by the president, et cetera. Just briefly, as we close here, what's going on with science in the US? And is that something that we should be worried about?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think, it's all part of the same theme of pushback against government, against institutions, right? questioning of science and data. And I think, beyond the bully pulpit that RFK has to talk about this stuff, the actual cuts that have been made to key institutions, whether it's the National Science Foundation, right, the National Institutes of Health, NOAA, NASA, I mean, that is all really concerning for not only today's research, but also the science and research of the future. Right? And
Absolutely.
and thinking about how people who are interested in this stuff will look elsewhere other than the United States for where to go to do their work and to study. And I've seen universities in Europe and countries trying to take advantage of that,
Yep.
and offer opportunities for scientists. I think the other thing I'm worried about beyond just the cutting off is also the impact on trust
Hmm.
in data that does still come out from the US government. Can we trust what they're saying about certain things? You see this in the health space, right? With the conversation on Tylenol last week and all of that.
Right.
When you once trust is very easy to break. And once it's gone, it takes years and years to rebuild. And so even if you get new leadership in Washington, you're not going to be able to snap your fingers and return to where we were. So thinking about, taking starting now to think about how to rebuild that, I think is absolutely critical. And hope that our partners and friends in Canada and Europe will take up the mantle and keep the flame alive of good science and good investment here going forward.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, it was, briefly back to the climate change topic, obviously, and in particular because of the shale gas revolution in the States, tracking methane emissions has been of vital importance, right? And I mean,
Hmm.
is it one or two satellites that NOAA had just recently put up and weren't even in
Hmm.
operation for a year, right? And now
Yep.
magically, neither of them works anymore, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly. And it's just there's no rhyme or reason that I can see other than just, anti-government wanting to cut spending without thinking carefully about what is needed. And again, going back to security, all of that data and information from NOAA and NASA and these places inform military decision making, right? Inform
Absolutely.
planning. And if you don't have that, you can't make good decisions or make good plans for operations in the Indo Pacific, for example, if you don't understand the typhoons in the region, right? So there are real, near term national security implications of that. And again, this is a place where I think, and I've seen members of Congress from both sides of the aisle understand that and try and push in the right direction. But it's an uphill battle right now.
Yeah. So was it your book? Am I remembering this from somewhere else, Aaron? The whole somebody asked, was it Truman or was it Eisenhower? What was it that really made D-Day? Was that your book?
That was, yeah, I talk about it in my book. Yeah. Yeah. It was better meteorologists than the Germans, right? That's what he said, because they knew
Exactly.
when to land on the beaches at Normandy and they delayed a little bit because of a forecast they had.
Hmm.
And without that, they would have missed their window. So yeah, it really
Exactly.
matters.
Great weather data, right? So,
Mhm.
and I think, for anybody that's ultimately listening who finds themselves in conversations about this sort of stuff, I mean, obviously we're not saying that the climate change causes weather, but it can cause weather to be more, right? It can
Mhm.
cause weather to be more often, more intensity, more precipitation, these sorts of things, right? And to deviate from norms that have been pretty established for a long time and that we've basically designed our infrastructure and our lives for those norms, and that's now shifting.
Mhm.
But I think, yeah, fascinating. I mean, we are finding here in Europe that most business leaders that we interact with are quite calm about their understanding of climate and the risk that it represents, and the
Mm.
fact that some of the predictions that were made are materializing sooner than expected, right? Less confident on how long it's going to take to get some of these solutions in terms of the energy system in place.
Mhm.
And from our point of view, because we also work a bit on the energy side, that's almost ironic because when you look at some of the adoption curves, interestingly, some of the reddest places in the United States of America are most aggressive in installing distributed renewable energy sources and storage because they equal freedom.
Mhm.
Freedom from cost, freedom from blackouts, freedom from any number of other things, right? You're able to control your own adventure more with some of those things, right? So it's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, exactly. I'm continuously put in situations as somebody who's originally an American to to explain to people what's going on, because for folks in other parts of the world, it's extremely unsettling. Um, some of the signaling that happened just with the Greenland discussion, as an example,
Mhm.
was obviously found to be shocking. You, after as many years of your career traveling around the world and carrying the messages that you've been carrying, must find it a little bit, I don't know if rich is the right word or weird is the right word, to be sitting here and trying to project a little bit of hope that the center will hold.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the through line throughout my career has been my belief that the United States can be a force for good in the world, but sometimes it needs a little help to
Yeah,
get there. And I think that belief has been challenged like never before in the past year. But I also think it's my responsibility as someone who lives here to try and push things in the
mm,
right direction. And there are a lot of people like that, right? So
totally.
but yeah, no, it's again, I mean, and this goes back to something I talk about a little bit in my book is this idea of questioning our underlying unstated assumptions, right?
Hmm.
And when it comes to the role of the US in the world, we have a lot of unstated assumptions about what that is, whether it's the guarantor of NATO security, right? Whether it's generally that the US is driven by democratic values. I mean, all of those things, we should be asking ourselves some tough questions about how
We should.
we analyze and understand the US.
Right, absolutely. And I think, the if one of the results of this is that Europe stands up closer together, and takes more or most or all of the responsibility for their collective resilience, et cetera. If that's one of the outcomes of all of this, that probably will have been a good thing, because the sort of situation that's persisted since World War II cannot be a permanent situation. That obviously just doesn't work. But it's going to be a damn interesting discussion to talk in Europe about who gets to be in charge if the US is not going to be the NATO Supreme Allied Commander, right? So,
Yeah.
but, wait for that. It's going to be good television. Hopefully, everybody can be nice to each other and come up with a very good result of that. We did choose to name this podcast "What the Fuck Now," and part of that was just because we're looking out at the things that are happening in the world and clocking a change and wondering what we should do now. And so, for the audience here, that's primarily European business leaders, given everything that we've just been through, what sort of advice would you offer them as they seek to lead through this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess I would say two things. One, as we've talked about throughout this episode, is the need to look at the US beyond what's happening in Washington, right? To look at what's happening at the state level, look at what's happening out across the country and have a broader picture of the US. And I think that'll give you a better sense of what possible futures there are. At the same time, you're looking there. Also, I think you need to be looking east to China and to understand. We didn't talk about this much, but in terms of climate and clean energy and investment, they just got a lot of attention because of their announcement at the UN General Assembly about
I
cutting
did.
emissions. And, first time they've really committed, but yet it's still not enough. But I'm more interested in what they're doing more than what they're saying and watching how they're stepping into places where the US has now stepped back, where they're providing a green technology, clean energy. I mean, that I think is going to be the story of energy over the next couple of decades. And understanding that deeply, I think is absolutely critical to understanding the geopolitical landscape and opportunities and challenges as we go forward.
Nice, right? I mean, it's a technology oriented energy future, right? And the Chinese
Mhm.
are basically rolling up ownership, manufacturing, R&D, raw material sourcing, you name it, for solar
Mhm.
panels, turbines, windmill blades, and critically batteries, because I think batteries are really the next big story of all of this. So I think that's a super well made point. There's a in a way you could say there's almost a battle of the future going on,
Yeah.
and the U.S. is like on a bit of a side road at the moment.
Mhm.
They've stopped for a discussion amongst themselves, and the rest of the world is really moving at breakneck speed. I mean, I think there's a number of narratives that cycle out there about China, being the biggest emitter and building all these coal plants. But when you look at it from a per capita perspective and you factor in the fact that they're making products for most of the rest of the world, So much of that is really our emissions and not theirs. The journey that they're on from a new renewable energy power generation point of view, et cetera, is fascinating. And they've got one big motivation that's undeniable, and that is that they're a net importer of fossil fuels.
Mhm.
They are, ironically, it's an independence play, right?
Yeah.
They want freedom. And so I think, there's we're going to look back in 10 or 15 or 20 years, and it's going to have been a very interesting transition. But I think it's inevitable, but it's not my job to predict the future. So we really thank you for taking time out from fighting the good fight over there in Washington. And we hope there are very many more of you over there doing so, because I think, everybody that I meet here is rooting for reason and science. And I think, isn't it Stan McChrystal who just published a book on character? We're, rooting for character, rooting for decency, rooting for, those things that we hope all bind us together, and not some of the other less fortunate traits and characteristics and language that we've heard more of lately.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think there are a lot of us, so I still have hope.
Awesome, Aaron. Thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You've been listening to What the Fuck Now, hosted by Rick Wheatley and produced by the S7 team. We love that you've listened, but we'd love even more to hear what you think. If you've got feedback or ideas for guests or topics we should tackle, we're all ears. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next time.